and welcome to this edition of IIEA Insights with me, Dan O'Brien. The past week has seen the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The past 2 weeks has brought a series of remarks and actions by the US president and figures in his administration which suggest a deep and profound change in the US position towards its traditional allies in Europe in multiple ways, including on security and defense. In this episode, we'll focus on what all this means for for security and defense in small European countries in particular, and in the years ahead, and what could be done on defense now that the US cannot be depended on to guarantee European security. Joining us to discuss these matters is Jakub Janda, the director of the Czech Foreign Affairs think tank, the European Values Centre for Security Policy, Mark Mellett, former chief of staff of the Irish Defence Forces, and Niels Pultz, a lifelong Danish diplomat who, amongst other things, served as ambassador to Dublin 10 years ago. Thank you all for joining the discussion today. So with that, if I could come to you first, Jakub, those statements by the US president and his administration have raised serious questions. How do you evaluate their impact on Czech and European security? Of course, as Czechia being a NATO member.
Thank you for having me. So I will jump right into it. Pretty much we are scared in Central Europe because of what's happening, because there are several important things happening. One is that Russia is actually on a march. Unfortunately, Russia is let's say relatively slowly winning in Ukraine. It has not won strategically, but it is making advancements, not only on the tactical level on the ground, but also in terms of having a strategic support mainly of China, which is unfortunately very significant for the Russian defense or war industry. So that's one aspect. Second aspect which is happening is President Trump, and his negotiations or very hard pressure on Ukraine. And that's another segment which is very, very worrying for us sitting in Central Europe. And the third segment of what's happening is the, let's say, I would say negotiations or the pressure by the new US administration over NATO allies in Europe, who have very much underfunded our defense spending. That's very clear and on so many levels. Pretty much the only ones taking it pretty seriously have been Poland, Baltic nations, and some of the Scandinavian nations as well. But countries, including my own, have pretty much underfunded our military. Just to give you an example, Czech military stands at 2.0% right now. Just a couple of days ago, Czech Prime Minister announced in a special address to the nation that the plan is to go to 3% GDP spending, which is, I would say, not sufficient, but at least the movement is there. Because very practically what we are doing is much of the, let's say, defense spending in recent years has not even hit the 2% threshold. And I know that sounds like a mythical number, but in very practical sense, that was the threshold agreed by NATO nations in the 90s after basically NATO, US and NATO have pretty much won the Cold War. So the thinking was, let's pretty much dismantle most of our militaries so that we could go to very, very minimal standards of defense spending, which was supposed to be to 2%, so that when we have a strategic warning ahead of a major crisis, we will have a couple of years to really boost our military into the full readiness. That was the thinking in the 90s. We kept that as NATO. Czech Republic joined NATO in 1999 as a new member in the new wave of winning. And for example, Czech Republic for 19 years has not fulfilled the 2% promise, but to itself mainly. So we are pretty much now catching up, and I'm really afraid that we are very late in doing it. So pretty much what you are seeing is what we call NB8, Nordic Baltic nations, who are pretty much the core of the alliance currently in defense terms, in terms of capabilities and spending and pretty much real capabilities. But the overall picture in a European part of NATO is pretty grim. We are not really if you look at the capacities and capabilities, what we do have as European NATO, and what Russia has with the Chinese backing currently, it is obviously not enough. So if I summarize it, where we are as kind of Central Eastern European nations within NATO, we are pretty much scared by all of this. So there is very urgent preparations on, I would say, the civilian side as well, but also on the military capability side. So maybe I'll stop here, but happy to go more into detail in the discussion.
That's really concise, gives us a good flavor, Jakub. So many thanks, and maybe we will come back to that whole of society. I see your security strategy very much emphasizes that. I think we'd be interested to hear more about that dimension. But Mark, over to you on a similar question. How do you think recent changes, obviously going back to 2022, the invasion, but in particular the more recent changes in terms of questions around US involvement in European security and defense, how do you analyze that from an Irish perspective?
Yeah, I would say, Dan, Ireland, like the rest of Europe, has enjoyed an extraordinary period of peace and security, notwithstanding the Balkan Wars and up to the point of the Russian Federation invasion of Ukraine. We've had 80 years of peace, security, and economic growth. And a lot of that is built on the vision of Robert Schuman, who, I suppose, established the principles that we now see in EU today. But it's also built on the backstop of the US, going right back to the Marshall Plan, $15 billion in the aftermath of the Second World War, and US interest in the decades that followed. And that has been extraordinary in terms of a key part of the stability. But I think in terms of the first Trump administration, we began to see, maybe a little bit earlier than that, a sense of reticence on the US side and more demands for Europe to stand up itself. And I think in 2016, we had the French initiative of strategic autonomy. And, you know, the reality is strategic autonomy is about Europe being able to collaborate where possible, but challenge where necessary. Difficulty, however, is Europe doesn't have a culture, nor does it have the capabilities outside obviously aligning with NATO. And there's always been a debate in my time on the military committee of the EU military committee in terms of a fear of replication. But we're at that point now. If you move that on to Ireland, I mean, we're particularly vulnerable. I often call us the lonely sentinel, an island behind an island on the western frontier of Europe. We've an extraordinary jurisdiction. In recent years, we've lodged claims with the Commission on limits of continental shelf. So we've almost 1 million square kilometres of jurisdiction where we have sovereignty or sovereign rights. And sovereign rights that are not upheld are more imaginary than real. So to make that matter even more focused, we've seen the threats from Russian Federation naval task groups to annex or appropriate 5,000 square kilometres of our area of sovereign rights for 5 days. That's an area the size of Wexford, Wicklow and Dublin. And it was outrageous to suggest that a state's economic zone would be actually appropriated by another state for whatever activity. In this case, it was for exercises. So I suppose coming to a close of my opening few points, I would say that I wrote a paper recently for the Institute on what's past as prologue. If you understand, to understand where you're going to go, you need to understand where you've come from. And the reality is Ireland's got a deficit in terms of its culture relating to defence. And it's there for over 100 years. And until we address that cultural deficit, we'll find it challenging to ramp up and build up in terms of the capabilities we require, not just in terms of our national requirements, but also in terms of our requirements of being a good partner and a good neighbour to the states around us.
Thanks, Mark. And that Mark's paper is available on the website for those who want to read it. Niels, from your perspective in Northern Europe, as one of the most Atlanticist countries, I suppose, in Europe, pro-American, how do you view recent events? And in particular, you've had the additional issue of the interest in Greenland from the US president.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm happy to be on the panel with my two predecessors. And I agree very much what they said, especially what Jakub said, because we feel the same threat as you do in Central Europe. The closeness to Russia, and we are the entry to the Baltic Sea. There are various sea lanes there, and so that we feel, together with the other Nordic and Baltic states, a threat, and therefore we have increased our defense budget sharply over the last 3 years, not least since Russia invaded Ukraine. And that also brought us to realize that an opt-out we had on the European Defense Cooperation had to be abolished. And on the 1st of June 2022, 67% of Danish population supported that give up of this opt-out, so that we now can participate fully, to the extent we want, in the cooperation, in the military cooperation within the EU. That is, as you know, the permanent structural cooperation PESCO in the area of secure defense, as well as we are becoming member of European Defense Agency. And of course, as also Jakub said, since the early 90s, we had harvested a so-called peace dividend, meaning that we didn't have we gave up, so to speak, the old defense policy and strategy, going from the territorial defense to one where we could go with the US into their various missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and so forth, a kind of expeditionary force, meaning that when Russia invaded the Crimea in 2014, we had a very low defense budget, and not until a few years ago, actually, we started increasing up to a level of 2%. And we have, just like the Czech Republic, we have now a target above 2, perhaps 3.5%. It's not been very precise yet, but we are closer to 5 than 2% in the target that the government is seeking, supported by quite a strong economy that we have had for a number of years and still have. So let's say we have also a very strong popular support to what we are doing in relationship to Ukraine. We are assisting Ukraine as one of the most supportive countries in relation to GDP, and that is a very strong commitment also at the popular level, because we see it as also stated by Ukraine president, that they are fighting for the freedom of Europe in Ukraine. So therefore we have to support them as much as we can. The problem, of course, with building up defense capabilities is that everybody is doing that at the same time. So, and the capacity in the various industries is not sufficient strong so that they can deliver at a very short notice. But there we are, and but the will is there.
Niels, just any update on the Greenland situation? Has that been raised recently? Is there any anything happening there recently?
Well, two things. The first one is that the last statement by President Trump was not the first one. The first one came in 2019, where he was president for the first time. He wanted to buy Greenland and used the word buy Greenland. Our prime minister, who was also prime minister at that time, used the word absurd about that. And in Danish, that seems less harsh than perhaps in the American years. So President Trump was not very pleased with that remark. The latest reaction or saying from President Trump and the visit of Donald Trump Jr. in Greenland and earlier this year has been received by the Danish government with prudence, I would say. I'm quite sure there's a lot of business going on, discussions going on at the diplomatic channels. Publicly, has been only the reaction that Greenland is not to be bought. It's up to the Greenlanders to decide their destiny. This remarks and this discussion falls in the middle of the election campaign in Greenland. There are going to be elections to the parliament on March 11th. So that's this kind of debate, of course, comes at a very unfortunate situation, as in an election campaign, sometimes it's difficult to have all nuances. It's more red and white, black and white. And there is a discussion in Greenland of their relationship with Denmark. And there is a will to have independence. But the problem is that, or the situation is that, there's no clear definition of what that means. And how there is a commission which, within the next 2 years, will publish a report on what kind of different kinds of independence could be discussed and sought at, and eventually it's of course up to Greenlanders to decide. The 56,000 of them, and they know that in the foreseeable future it will be very, very difficult for them to be independent totally, economically and in many other ways. But also that perhaps we also have to be clear that if they want to become total independent, there's no such thing as a vacuum in geopolitics. If there's someone absent or vacant, someone else will fill in that part. Therefore, perhaps.
Niels, just very briefly, Niels, in terms of Danish public opinion rather than Greenland public opinion, have Danes become less pro-American because of this? Are there any opinion polls about views towards the United States since this issue became a bigger issue? As you say, it was raised in 2019, but this time.
Yeah, this time is different, and I mean, remember the UN Security Council, and there last Monday there was a vote where the US and Russia were on the same side, and 5 European countries on the other side on the 3 years anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there was no harsh words towards the actions of Russia in that declaration. Therefore, the 5 European countries could have voted against, but decided to abstain. And in our representative simply said that for us, we need to reaffirm our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And you can see that is not the same thing as being stated by the US in these days. And therefore, I'm not aware that there have been public opinion poll, but I can see in the media and so on, there's a pretty strong popular resentment towards American products and going to visit the US. So there is I think, quite a strong popular feeling that the US is not as it used to be. And it's not, we cannot be sure that they'll be there if need be, as we thought until 2 or 3 months ago.
Okay, thanks. Jakub, in terms of public opinion in Czech Republic, do people support the increase in defense spending as they do, as Niels has outlined in Denmark, or is that a somewhat more contested? And also in terms of, Mark mentioned strategic autonomy. For many countries, that sort of has been a French idea, and there's been some resentment. What's the feeling at political level towards the idea of strategic autonomy?
Mm-hmm. So in the Czech Republic, the public generally does support the military itself and increased defense spending. That is usually not a problem. The problem is usually the government's will to do that, of the opposition parties criticizing it and spend enough or not being to spend effectively. That's the usual democratic politics. So no real issue there, I would say. But the problem in line, because pretty much what Ukraine did for all of us is that it has bought us something like 2 or 3 years of kind of warning time. And only few European countries use that warning time or preparatory time when Ukraine is pretty much holding the Russian machinery in Ukraine, not attacking other European nations for now. The issue is that even if you put great defense spending with the real military capabilities will be fielded, will be coming to real practice in 2, 3, 4 years from now. It depends on the specific weapon systems. So that's one of our real problems which we are having. But on your second question on strategic autonomy, so I mean, because that really depends on what we mean by that. Because very specifically, supporting more of European cooperation, there is no real issue within that. Most Central European countries would tell you strategic autonomy is good until you use it as a tool against the United States. That's pretty much, at least in countries like Czech Republic, Baltic nations, Poland, Romania, that's how the French policy proposal have been understood and pretty much taken. Obviously, now the strategic reality is that we are facing a lot of pressure by the United States, but at the same time, we shouldn't forget that pretty much US military is present in Central Europe. US nuclear umbrella over Central Europe is present, at least until now. And so we are seeing a lot of very negative rhetorics, and I would say pretty hard pressure diplomacy by a US president. But we are still near from Central Europe. If that happens, that will be a huge strategic problem. So everybody in Central Europe is very sensitive and very, I would say, relatively silent about most of it. There's a lot of behind closed door negotiations with the United States because it's super sensitive for all of us. So that's pretty much where we are now.
You mentioned about those intense private negotiations. Would you be slightly more optimistic about the relations, Czech's relations and Europe's relations with the US from what you've heard privately than some of the more dramatic statements that have come publicly?
I have to say there are multiple layers of this. One is pretty much being that most kind of Northern Central European countries are pretty much hiding behind Poland, not only in military terms in defense against Russia, but also in terms of relationship with the new US administration, because the Polish government and specifically Polish President Duda actually have pretty much the best relations anybody has with President Trump and his people, which is good news for us, despite all the other things which are happening very negatively, because there are pretty much at least three things happening at the same time. One is the Russia-Ukraine negotiations of the US. Second is the NATO renegotiation of balance of burden sharing. And third are actually trade deficit, or let's say trade wars between the EU and the United States. And all these three things do not seem to be related, but we all know they pretty much are, because the actors are pretty much are involved. And every European country has slightly different interests. So that's pretty much where we are. So let's say the biggest scare, I would say the biggest fear we have in Central Europe is that President Trump might pretty much lose or fail in the negotiations, which might pretty much lead to partial collapse of Ukraine itself, and basically a very bad deal over the heads of Central Europeans. That's pretty much our worst case fear. To some extent, we have seen some backtracking on the side of US government, although many people in the mid-level of the new administration are not in their offices yet. They are still being confirmed by the Senate and will take some time. So the kind of relative, I would say, more professional hands at the hands of the middle level of the administration, that will take some time. But those strategic negotiations are happening right now. They are not waiting a couple of months. So that's why this is pretty much a culmination point, I'm afraid, where many things might break. Because in Ukraine, it is pretty partially catastrophic, I would say, in terms of the foreign policy angle by the United States. Definitely the deal might be relatively okay at the end, but the fragility of the Ukrainian society is actually very big right now. They are in a survival war for 3 years and against an enemy which is almost 4 times bigger than they are. So it's very hard time for them, and we are not really doing enough as Europeans to help them, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you, Jakub. Worrying thoughts there. Mark, in terms of the point you made about strategic culture in your paper, can Ireland develop a strategic culture, a concern about defence in a short time? Culture takes a long time to change. Or how do you view public opinion on this? There was an opinion poll at the weekend that showed considerably more, I think it was 45%, supported increased defence spending relative to about 25% who didn't. Do we require a strategic culture, or will events just lead public opinion in a certain way and that people will support greater deterrent capacity because they see the risks that are there?
Yeah, well, I just, despite a very limited investment in defence over the decades, so we should be very proud of our defence forces in terms of what they have done with the capabilities they have. And we have the longest unbroken record of UN service of any state. But we've made our sacrifices. We've lost nearly 50 soldiers in the cause of peace. But from a starting point in terms of investment in defence, I think the signals are good coming from government. In the end of the commission, a recent commission on defence forces, there were 3 levels of ambition. I think the focus has been on level of ambition 2, but I have seen a dialogue now that we need to go to level of ambition 3. Coming back to the point of strategic culture, if we look at what culture is about, our culture is, I suppose, rooted in a sense that we are quite secure where we are on the periphery of Europe and nobody is really going to interfere with us. That's changed. State security is inextricably linked with economic security, which is inextricably linked with energy security. If we look at our economic security, that's built on, I suppose, a high density of the tech industry, which are located in this country. The very arteries of their success are subsea cables that carry data across the Atlantic and elsewhere. They're now vulnerable. In terms of energy security, we are extremely vulnerable. The hybrid attacks that we've seen elsewhere in jurisdictions on interconnectors could easily happen in our jurisdiction and impact pretty heavily on our energy security, which would then impact on economic security. So all the cards are lining up, I think, for us to actually have a change in attitude. But, you know, somebody once said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. In my experience, it devours everything in front of us. It really needs, I think, a courageous leadership from the political side to actually set out where the threats are today and the level of ambition that we're looking at. We should not be just aspiring to level of ambition 2. We really need to look at moving the dial so that we actually increase our spending from 0.2%, where it is at present, up to something approaching, I suppose, a more reasonable investment. The issue of civil society, I think, is critically important in terms of the constituency that needs to support this and understand this. But also, I think, in terms of the market and enterprise, we need to flip, I think, the discussion in the sense that, you know, defence is a cost driver. It can easily be an investment driver in terms of if you actually stimulate the right industries, you can actually create employment around it. And given that our economics in many cases are dependent on a security of supply in terms of energy or communications, we really need to actually, I think, hedge on that to ensure that we actually have the market recognizing that increased defence spending is good for the state. And in fact, I'd make one final point. Defence can actually be a profit centre in terms of stimulating young companies that create employment. There's great companies like Cathix Ocean and NACE that have cutting-edge subsurface technologies that are using AI and machine learning to actually really radicalise the way in which critical underwater infrastructure is provided for. And other companies such as Cathix Ocean up in Carlingford are doing great things. So I think the landscape has changed. The political will is growing to actually address this. And on the final point, just on the issue of military non-aligned, yes, we've been military non-aligned for 100 years, but we haven't been neutral in terms of our interests of the collective. And multilateralism and bilateralism, I think, is where we need to look at in terms of how we can strengthen our relationship with our nearest European neighbour, which is the UK, our nearest EU neighbour, which is France, and our nearest transatlantic neighbour, which is the US, in the context of defence and security.
And just maybe I'll say, during the general election campaign, I was very surprised how little issues around security and defence came up. Does that possibly say that the political class is well behind the curve on this? You said things were more, it was gaining more attention, but as I say, it really struck me during the general election campaign how little it was discussed, if at all.
You're absolutely right. I actually was quite frustrated at that. I looked at, you know, some of the northern states in Finland and Norway and Sweden. It was the top three items, not the top one or two. It was the top three items in those jurisdictions. I didn't see it in the top 10 items during the political discussion and the debate leading up to the general election back in November. So that did worry me, that actually there is a greater leadership required in terms of having this discussion. And I do think that, in fact, events like this, and you're just talking about the numbers who have signed up for this event, there is a shift in terms of interest in civil society, in the market, and I think also in the political, with a view to addressing the issue of defence and security. We have a steep hill to climb in terms of acquiring the capabilities whereby we're exposed at present. But I think discussions like this are helpful in terms of setting the agenda.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, just to pick up on that point, if we'd had this discussion maybe 2-3 years ago, there would probably be 20 people joining the call, more than 200 people registered for this event today. So I certainly think our members are aware of how big a change has occurred in this space and how much it's going to come in the future.
Dan, if I could make
sure.
just one point, it's always good to have a North Star in terms of what we should look like. I remember I visited Finland in my last job, and I was really, I suppose, taken aback at their preparation. They prepared for this long before the Ukraine invasion. I remember talking to the Chief of Defence, and his language was, if and when we go to war, this is what we will do. And they have a whole of government and a whole of society approach to defence and security. It's not something that just has happened since 2022. This has been rooted, I think, over decades of concern. The recent events, I suppose, investments in terms of F-35 and other capability really shows that they're willing to put their money where their mouth is. But it's not just about a defence issue. This is a whole of society matter. And it is, the language they have used has been that they are preparing society for it. It's been done in most recent communications. Society need to be prepared for the challenges that lie ahead. And that's, I think, the difference. We should be looking at countries like Norway, like Finland, who actually have been really serious about defence and security for decades.
Jakub, can I come to you? Because in researching for this event, I read your country's 2023 security strategy, and that whole of society approach was mentioned there. Could you talk a little about that? Has that been a tradition, or are you adopting that from countries like Finland, and just explain how that's working out?
We are pretty much in the Czech Republic behind the curve compared to Finland, Sweden, or the Baltic nations. And not only in terms of defense spending, but also in terms of how our population is ready. I think we, as most European nations, we went through the relative patience of our military in the 2000s, so in the counter-terrorism wars. But since 2014, there was slow awakening. And where we are now is that we have quite a lot of programs for essentially talking to the adult, but also, let's say, more junior population of the Czech Republic about how the crisis might look like. Very specifically, we are not a physically speaking frontline state like Poland or the Baltic nations, but we are a de facto country which would be serving as a logistics base for NATO allies if the Baltics or Poland gets invaded by Russia. Plus, we will be likely hosting hundreds of thousands of refugees, which we already are doing now for Ukraine. Almost 500,000 Ukrainians in a country of 10 million. But that would be the case. Oh, sorry.
Thanks. Thanks, Niels. On that whole of society approach to defence, is that similar in Denmark? Is there that sort of culture of whole of society resilience?
We're getting there. As Jakub said, we are behind the curve, but we're getting there. We are now established a new ministry which had to deal with all the challenges of civil society if and in case and catastrophe happens, not only war, but also other kinds of catastrophes, so that we actually have both local and central authorities working together, knowing who is doing what. But as Mark said, if you look at Finland and perhaps also Norway, they have been there always, and especially Finland, I would laud a lot, because they have never believed in any kind of peace, or they always knew since the war in 1939 to 40 with the Soviet Union, who their neighbor was, and they never given up a very strong defense. They can muster about 1 million people, soldiers, within short notice, and I think they all weaponized as well. So I would think that having Finland and Sweden joining NATO has strengthened the northern flank of NATO extremely much, and also Sweden had given their neutrality for decades, built up quite a sophisticated defense industry. So I think that, and we know that now in Denmark, that we have to seek a much closer relationship between the other Nordic countries as well as the Baltic countries. For instance, we have seen over the last few years a number of attacks, not only cyber attacks, but also on the gas cables and electricity cables at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, and damaged by various ships, and most of them were not accidents but deliberate actions. Therefore, the 8 NATO countries around the Baltic have established a new force called Baltic Sentry to patrol the ocean and stop any unfriendly agents who would continue to harm that kind of a warfare, but without military means. But that actually has had some unpleasant consequences over the last 2-3 years, and we will try to avoid that. So, and therefore, there's a very strong support also in the public opinion to enhance our capability, not only military but also at the civil society, and where we are lacking a lot. But hopefully, the new ministry will be able to launch some good plans that will be effective within a not too distant future.
Right. Look, we're just a minute over time. Thank you very much to all 3 of you for giving us your time today. We'll be covering this topic from various angles, increasingly at the Institute. If members clearly have found it interesting, given the number of people who've signed up, if members have thoughts on areas of research, areas that they would like us to focus on, please do get in touch. We do really want to do more in this area, given it's just becoming so topical and so important. So with that, thanks everyone for joining today, and in particular thanks to our 3 speakers. Have a good afternoon to everyone.